Thanks for having us. We're the American Indian Policy Institute, and we are part of WATS now. We moved over about a year ago. So we work on Native issues. We're primarily a public policy institute, and we do a lot of national work, especially around technology, broadband, digital divide, and such. That's been my area of specialty for more than 12 years now, and Brian's as well. And so when the pandemic hit, I mean, we're all hearing about what's happening in Indian country, but what happened that first week and a half, I started going to these meetings. The Native American leadership started having meetings about our students and what was going on with our Native students. We have 3,000 Native students at ASU. I don't know if y'all know. And of those 3,000 students, about 1,500, 12 to 1,500 are online students already. But we were worried about those students and making sure they transitioned. A lot of the, in-campus students were returning home. We were trying to reach them, literally finding out that they did not have connections at all to Indian country. From Indian country, they didn't have connections to do their work. So what we ended up doing is creating a couple of briefs. And so that's what we're going to talk about briefly today. I'm not going to talk too long, so you can go forward, Brian. We're really going to talk about just really 3 things that are in 2 briefs, and I can share those and upload those, and also a paper we're referencing that these reference. So in terms of the tribal digital divide, next, Brian, in Indian country, what we found in a recent study that we did, the Tribal Technology Assessment, is that 18% of tribal residents have no internet access at home, wired or land-based. 33% rely on service from cell phone or a smartphone, and 31% have spotty connection and such. We found this in our Tribal Technology Assessment. Next slide, Brian. And the Tribal Technology Assessment is something we released last fall. And it was a pretty lengthy paper based on original research and interviews and such. I won't go into all the specifics of it because that's its own presentation. But it suffice it to say, we came up with some different information than perhaps the FCC did in their broadband deployment report that just came out 2 days ago, which is, we're not all connected. We knew this, we've been sounding the alarm, so taking this information that we had, and then the experience that Brian and I both had, we started work quickly on a couple of briefs. So Brian, you can move it forward. We really needed to know, we were really starting to see what the impact was on students, and it was pretty significant. As the university transitioned to online academic coursework, that assumed that Native students had access to consistent, reliable internet options. What we really found, obviously it's not a study, but anecdotally, we really found is not just Native students didn't have connectivity. Lots of students are not getting internet in their home because it's ubiquitous everywhere else. Starbucks, the campus, and such. When the Starbucks is closed, campus is closed, there's not hotspots around, these folks did not have connectivity. Or if they did, they couldn't do the kind of robust work that was being put up on and such. So as we started, looking at this, go forward, Brian, this digital divide was really parsing out on lack of availability. It was multiple divides: access, affordability, type of access, quality of access, location of access, not to mention speeds. In fact, the Native American Student Services was literally, first they emailed everybody, see if they had access. I laugh, in a sad way, because obviously if you're emailing somebody to find out if they have access, and they don't have access, they're not going to get your email. But that was really the point where we realized we needed to inform the president's office. We were asked to inform the president's office here as to what's really going on with the digital divide, because they were like, well, you emailed them all. People responded. And we're like, wait. So the Vice President of Tribal Initiatives, Jacob Moore, asked us to put together a couple of briefs about what the nature of the divide was. The first one was just an informer. You can go forward, Brian. And that talked about Indigenous students. So that first informer is about 2.5, 3 pages. And it talks basically about the impact of the closure of anchor institutions and libraries and public Wi-Fi and what that means for students. It could be applied to lots of other students as well, but we knew this was happening to our tribal students. So, and then second, those who do have home access might not be able to participate in the sort of data intensive online activities and such. And then third, we have students that are being forced to withdraw altogether. Now, the reasons can vary. Maybe it's their family, maybe it's lack of connectivity, maybe it was having to choose between purchasing Wi-Fi and internet service over food. I mean, that's a real thing that's happening out there. When we started calling all of our students, and I'm just going to do a shout out for UTO. UTO was amazing, and they literally one person at a time ran hotspots to people that we could connect. Once we identified a person and whether or not they were in a footprint of somebody where there was a hotspot like Verizon or AT&T, they were running them out hotspots and laptops if they needed them to help them get through this semester. But we needed leadership to understand this. And once they did understand this, you can go forward, Brian. Once they did understand this, they asked us for some policy recommendations. And so we developed a second brief, which I'm gonna have Brian talk a bit about, which is in play right now. This brief was a set of policy asks to serve our tribal students. And it has been included in the president's ask of Congress. He has 5 asks from Congress that they put together in a brief that ASU is lobbying for in the next stimulus bill. And of those 5 asks, we are the 5th ask, and it's these points that Brian's going to talk about. So the president's taking it seriously, and we were well positioned to extrapolate our data from our tribal technology assessment and make specific recommendations to help Native students. So Brian, I'm going to toss it to you now.
Great, thank you, Traci. So as Traci had mentioned, you know, we were asked what were some of the high-level policy recommendations that ASU and President Crow could put forward to address the telecommunications access issues for students on tribal lands. So a lot of these recommendations have been supported by national organizations, both tribal and non-tribal organizations such as the National Congress of American Indians and the New America Foundation. One of the primary asks has been to support $2 billion in E-rate funding for states and tribal anchor institutions. This has been kind of put forward by a number of the non-tribal organizations as an effort to connect students with Wi-Fi service. There was, you know, some confusion, of course, being that schools are currently shut down. So, you know, why were people asking for increased funding for school connectivity? But in reality, you know, there are still opportunities for schools to operate as public Wi-Fi institutions. And so one of the things that's been talked about for a number of years has been looking at how can we utilize school buses as mobile Wi-Fi hotspots to provide service within those communities. So we definitely wanted to emphasize that even though schools and libraries and other anchor institutions are shut down, you know, there are still opportunities for those buildings to provide public Wi-Fi service, whether it be in a parking lot or, as I mentioned, utilizing school buses to provide mobile Wi-Fi hotspots within their communities. One of the other issues has also been focused on the Lifeline program, which is also administered by the FCC. The Lifeline program is very beneficial to those low-income individuals that exist at 135% below the poverty line, but also people are eligible if they are enrolled in SNAP or obtain Bureau of Indian Education Assistance or BIA General Assistance. So recognizing that Lifeline and its importance to those low-income individuals should also be, should not be capped, and should also be expanded to include unlimited voice, text, and data services for those individuals that, low-income individuals that currently may be unable to access the internet or pay for other internet services. The Lifeline program, as I mentioned, is very important in Indian country. On some reservations, such as the Gila River Indian community here in Arizona, just to the south of Phoenix, 85% of their residents could be eligible to enroll in the Lifeline program. But unfortunately, as much as there are individuals that are eligible to enroll in the program, unfortunately, because of the limited funding with the Lifeline program and the limited awareness about eligibility to actually enroll, unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of people that have subscribed that are currently eligible. One of the other major issues that we raised was also looking at the 2.5 gigahertz travel priority window. So this travel priority window was announced by the Federal Communications Commission last July. The FCC handed down an order stating that it would transition the certain frequencies within the 2.5 gigahertz band of spectrum to allow for them to operate commercial wireless services. Previously, these frequencies within the 2.5 gigahertz band had been allocated specifically for educational broadcast use. So ASU, for instance, has a number of licenses that they've subleased to different carriers such as Sprint. Last year, the ASU did announce a partnership with Sprint to utilize those licenses as a test bed for Internet of Things. But one of the big issues with this has been that in an unprecedented move, the FCC decided to allow tribes a first in right, a first in priority to obtaining those spectrum licenses if they were over their tribal lands, and allowed them to obtain those licenses prior to an auction mechanism being triggered. So in many cases, when the FCC holds these spectrum auctions, these licenses can be bid on at a high value. So for instance, a spectrum auction that was held a couple of years ago generated about, I believe it was $400 billion in revenue to the FCC, but I believe it was only about 40 some entities that had actually participated in those auctions. So realizing what a high price commodity spectrum licenses are, because they are limited in terms of who can have access to them, who can broadcast different types of communications frequencies over them. We wanted to make sure that the FCC would extend this tribal priority window for tribes to access those spectrum licenses, given the application process may have been hindered due to the shutdown of many different institutions, both on the reservation and off. So we wanted to make sure that even though the filing window closes on August 3rd of this year, we were kind of hoping that the FCC would extend that window until at least April 2021 to allow tribes to, again, complete their applications, submit them to the FCC. There are different processes involved with those applications in terms of acquiring a federal registration number. But again, just looking at this opportunity for tribes, again, an unprecedented opportunity, and allow for adequate time for tribes to obtain those licenses. So two of the other major policy recommendations we put forward was requesting that the federal government in general provide waivers for matching fund requirements under all broadband loan and grant programs, but also to not limit funding based on the quote unquote rurality of a tribe. This has been an issue that has been going on for a number of years at the Federal Communications Commission, where they have handed down orders, dedicating funding to wireless deployment, but with the caveat that such wireless funding could not go to tribal lands that were that had a population of in excess of 50,000 people, which can be problematic for tribes that border major metropolitan areas, even urban areas and suburban areas. That caveat could quickly disqualify a tribe from actually accessing those funding streams. So we wanted to be sure that in requesting that the federal government waive these matching fund requirements for these loan and grant programs, to also not limit them based on the rurality of the tribe. We also wanted to make it known that federal funding should be directed for broadband deployment and feasibility studies. This is kind of an issue that arose in the American Recovery Act back in 2008, where a lot of the funding, a lot of the stimulus funding at that time had been directed to quote unquote shovel-ready projects, which a lot of tribes unfortunately could not participate in because they didn't have those feasibility or different types of deployment studies done to ascertain where critical infrastructure was needed. So in recognition that in directing federal funding for these infrastructure type of projects, we also wanted to be cognizant that in directing that funding, it should also support the deployment and feasibility studies needed to actually get projects that are shovel ready. So that was all of our policy recommendations. Did you want to add anything, Traci?
Yeah, I'll just wrap it up. Thank you, Brian. So we had a really unprecedented opportunity to have President Crow put forth this as part of ASU's recommendations. And as you can see now, if you're watching the studies or watching what's going on, connectivity is not just an issue for us. It's an issue for so many of us. The quality of connectivity it's not just colleges, it's not just tribal folks, it's K through 12. It's an issue in this country, and it's been brought to the forefront by the pandemic. And so being able to respond in this way, hopefully with a set of recommendations that really mirror, well, they're agreed upon by the Indian country. We didn't make these up. These are based on lots of work from our research and other folks to come to a consensus from tribal folks. But they also, in a lot of ways, are going to be impactful for other communities as well. And so infrastructure is going to be coming up. There was a bill dropped yesterday in the House. I can't remember who dropped it. Maybe you do, Brian. But on broadband deployment, there may be a tribal broadband deployment. It probably won't get wrapped into the new stimulus bill like we thought it would, but it's coming because this is a serious issue. So our research provided a platform for us to make some recommendations that hopefully can have a positive impact on lots of folks, our students and others included. So I'll wrap it up there.